supporting the Assad regime in Syria, sending troops into Crimea, and influencing elections in Western democracies. The US says there's a long list of reasons for its latest sanctions on Russia.
The administration has sanctioned 7 Russian oligarchs, 12 companies, and 17 top government officials and allies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Today's sanctions and the totality of the administration's actions, which are in keeping with Congress's wishes, prove the president is absolutely correct when he says no one has been tougher on Russia.
But the Kremlin sees the restrictions as an unfair attempt to help American businesses.
We
see an absolute, obvious, simple, pragmatic goal behind the U.S. sanctions, to solve their economic challenges through uncompetitive means. The whole rationale about some bad Russians who must be punished is nothing but a political cover. It should not hide the economic essence, which is the pursuit of American commercial interests all over the world, contrary to the existing trade wars. We reserve our right to retaliatory measures.
Aluminum producer Rusal is the Russian company that's been worst hit. It says it may default on loans and lost half its market value on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange on Monday. The gloom spread to all major Russian stocks, taking the benchmark index down by more than 3%. And the ruble lost nearly 2% against the dollar. Despite threatening to hit back, Kremlin officials are downplaying the impact of the latest restrictions.
I've been to the US several times. They have imposed some sanctions, but this doesn't mean we will not interact with them. There are other countries where we can interact and solve these problems.
Analysts say these are some of the harshest conditions ever imposed on the Kremlin and its associates, and could go a long way in isolating Russia's economy. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, Jack Parrock has more on all this from Moscow.
Well, we've seen the Russian markets tumble initially today, down about 10%, now running about 7% down in the wake of these sanctions. There's also an interesting stat, being an unverified but interesting stat banding around social media on Twitter, etc., saying that the 7 Russian businessmen that were hit by these sanctions have lost a collective $3 billion in the first half day today, so this has been pretty major. One of the things we've seen is Rouble, the aluminium firm owned by Oleg Deripaska, who was hit by these sanctions, dropped 50% on the Hong Kong stock market. They're now talking about potentially having to look into ways to technically default on their repayments to creditors, etc. The Kremlin is saying that the sanctions are legally egregious. It'll take time to decide whether it's going to retaliate to the US sanctions, and that it's looking into supporting some of the companies that have been hit by these sanctions that are falling across the board. So when you look at the aluminium trade, and Rouble, the company that's really been hit hardest by this, they say that it's estimated that they produce 7% of the world's aluminium. They produced 3.7 million tons in 2017. Now the question is, can other unsanctioned Russian firms step up their production, step up the mining to get Russia, to keep this sort of business in Russia, or will other companies like Rio Tinto, for instance, step in and take over some of that business? Now, aluminium on the London Metal Exchange has gone up by about 2.5%, trading globally. So this is a big issue for the Russians.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in Michael Widmer in London. He's Chief Metals Strategist at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Thank you very much for talking to us, Michael. Now, the list of people who have been sanctioned here and companies reads like a who's who of Russia. How far-reaching could these sanctions be for the Russian economy?
Well, I think, let me focus actually more on the aluminium side, I think, and you've had this in your feature before already. I think Russia is quite an important aluminium producer for the global economy. Russian aluminium producers are very important job providers in Russia as well. So when you're looking at the impact overall, if you're actually cutting off Russian aluminium producers from the world market, domestic demand is only around 1 million tons, but they're producing like 3.7 million tons. So you can see that potentially causes a lot of headwinds for the companies in Russia.
We heard from the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev there saying this is just a way of helping American companies. Now, if we ignore the politics of that statement, how could US businesses benefit from this?
Look, it's actually quite a complex situation, because I think over the past few years what we have seen is a relatively steady demise of the US aluminium industry. And I think even President Obama, when he was still in office, locked a trade case with the WTO, primarily targeted at the Chinese at the time, and basically said, look, the competition is not entirely fair. We need to do something to shore up our aluminium industry. Then Trump came in, imposed obviously the tariffs recently. That is helping, starting to help some of the domestic producers as well. And I think the Russian sanctions had a little bit of a different trajectory, but in the end, I think they could potentially go a long way to pushing the global aluminium market into a deficit, which would then cause higher prices, which is something that we've seen already today, in turn potentially incentivizing some of the American aluminium smelters to actually increase output.
And could it potentially deter other countries from trading with Russia?
Look, this is always an interesting discussion. I mean, when you're looking at the tariffs, for instance, there was clear evidence that kind of the US took the initial step, and then other countries wanted to prevent like metal being diverted to them, so they're almost forced to actually implement their own tariffs. On the sanctions bit, is obviously a little bit more difficult, a bit more complex situation, but you could well find that consumers outside the US may show some reluctance in accepting Russian metal. Yes.
So how far-reaching then is the combined effect going to be of these US sanctions and tariffs on Russia's entire metals industry, do you think?
Look, I think for the aluminium industry in particular, I think it is potentially very far-reaching. I think there's other industries in the countries as well. There are copper producers. There are nickel companies. There are steel companies. They have a slightly different dynamic in there. But I think the focus of the last round of sanction was squarely on the country's aluminium industry, and I think there is you saw it today on the markets. There is certainly a lot of apprehension over their future.
Okay, I'm Michael Widmer. Thank you very much for talking to us.